These 3 games looked awesome to me. I wanted them so bad. And there were clearly a lot of people upset that they just kept refusing to translate these games. So what happened? A bunch of passionate people got together. They organized and they gave us
strategically
a strategy.
Yeah, it's very good.
They told us, call them every day, send them physical letters and email them every single day and bother them every single day. And I did it. I was one of them. I don't know how many people were as diligent as me, but I did that. I called Nintendo of America every day and said, hey, are you guys going to bring Xenoblade Chronicles to the West?
I'm really
what
interested.
about the last story? Pandora's Tower would be very cool. I'd pay for that if you guys brought it. Okay, thanks, bye. I got to the point where I was on a first-name basis with some of the people at the call center. Like, I talked to them so often that they knew I was calling again, and they were like, okay, we get it, like, yes. But that's what it took, right?
Right.
It took showing them there was a market for these products that they were dismissing. They didn't think there was. We proved that there was.
And look at Xenoblade now.
Right.
If you didn't do that.
If I wasn't on the phone every day with freaking Nintendo of America. I'd like to start today's episode by reading a quote from Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel.
Very nice. Very nice.
More commonly known as Hegel, the philosopher. Yes. And it is, what sliver of sense and reason might be contained in otherwise frightening or foreign phenomena? I have alluded to this, actually we have numerous times on the podcast in the past, but Hegel is incredibly difficult to understand.
He's very dense, but he's kind of the backbone of a lot of modern thinkers.
Yeah, Marx was obviously heavily influenced by him. Idealism was his thing. Yeah. All of that aside, the one thing I have taken away from reading Hegel that I very much agree with, I have totally embodied this principle, or at least try to. He really believed in learning from your intellectual enemies.
Right.
Now, I don't like using the word enemy for today's purposes because I don't consider
because
what
they
we're
aren't
doing.
Your enemies.
I don't.
The whole point is they're not your enemy.
I don't consider what we're doing today to be addressing an enemy. I don't look at it this way.
Very good. Very good.
So that's a strong word.
Yeah.
So, but
how about this? How about let's use a different word?
Learning
bad people who you hate and want to hurt you.
Let's put it.
Sorry, I'm getting us off on a bad foot.
Learning from points of view that you heavily disagree with.
Yeah, yeah. It's akin to venturing into the darkness to discover the treasure hidden in the back of the cave. Right.
And again, even I don't want to try to paint
darkness.
My intellectual opposite. It's not even intellectual opposite. It's just a person on the other side of this debate as being dark or in darkness. I don't want to paint it that way. All I'm trying to say is that he believed that really important bits of truth are found in those that you may find contemptible.
Yeah, the places you least want to look.
Right.
Or where you can find those things, yeah.
This is something that I truly, truly, in my heart of hearts, believe is so important for people to learn how to do. And whether or not anybody here watching agrees with that, it is something I believe in and something that I choose to practice.
Very good.
So, moving forward, this is something I want to do even more than perhaps I have in the past. We did the whole thing that launched this entire discussion on our podcast was when Unicorn Overlord came out several months ago.
And we thought it was dope, yeah.
Yeah, I love the game. Yeah. I love it. I think it's amazing. But there was some buzz that I saw on Twitter X at the time, a long thread from an account, Zakogdo, who was criticizing the localization. And I went through that and disagreed with a lot of what was there, and we did a whole video about that.
Yeah, we did, yeah.
And so this sort of has launched now into, we brought Alexander O. Smith on the show recently to talk about Japanese to English localization, and from somebody who's in the industry. And essentially, I feel like the mistake that I made in all of this was in just picking up some guy's thread on Twitter and just like criticizing and responding to it without reaching out and talking to the person directly.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
From now on, I think what I would rather do in situations like that would be to invite that person on the show in the first place.
I think it's a great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if I find something I object to, even if I don't end up having them on the show and we don't do a show, at least talking to them as close to face as possible is something that I just really believe is so important. And a large reason for why that is because, and there's tons of research done on this. This is something you can go look into yourself. The perseverance of belief, or what has been labeled by some the backfire effect. The idea that when you confront somebody who has a belief that is not rooted in fact, they believe something that is false, you confront them with the facts, they oftentimes will actually believe even more firmly what they do, and they will dispute the source of the fact, or in some other way try to get around that and why that can't be trusted, and they'll become more firm in the beliefs they already hold. This is not the fault of the person. This does not make them an idiot. This has something to do with the way humans just have evolved to be.
Yes.
That we are not rational beings. Our emotions have much heavier weight a lot of times in the way that we make decisions. And when we feel that facts that oppose or perhaps contradict our deeply held views, which are parts of our own identity, we perceive that as a threat.
Right.
There's a real emotional response that treats that fact as a threat. And so the response to that is to deny, denounce, otherwise do mental gymnastics to get around that fact, and continue believing the way we already believe.
And the more core the belief is, the more likely you are to do that, because that belief is holding up a lot of other things.
It's
you don't
a foundation
want to fall.
upon which you're propping up a lot of things about your personal identity.
Once again, as we've said many times in this podcast, do not build your foundation on sand. This goes with your mental stuff too. Like if there's something that can be easily, where the rug can be easily swept out from under you, but you don't know what that is until someone points it out. You don't know that you're on sand.
Yes.
It looks like a rock to me. I don't know.
Yes.
Until all of a sudden the rains come down and you realize, oh dang, I was on sand the whole time. Well, this is a problem. What do? I've got a whole house on this thing. I can't just move into I can't just start building a new house right now somewhere else. Right. But yeah, people often, it's a defense mechanism. For a reason.
100%.
And it's probably part of the reason why humans survived.
And this is why it is not effective at all to debate or argue with someone with whom you disagree by presenting them with facts.
Right.
It's actually highly ineffective a lot of times to try to convince somebody this way.
Right.
So that is primarily how people try to engage each other, particularly online. It's a lot of mockery, name calling, bullying, whatever, and then presenting all of the facts that support your position to this person as if that will in any way be convincing. And as anybody who's had an online argument with anyone in the world, even offline argument in person, can attest to, this just largely doesn't work.
Right.
It's not effective.
Yeah.
So I had pulled a bunch of articles that I kind of wanted to read some stuff from, but I think for the purpose of brevity in this particular case, I'm just going to read what I think is the solution to this problem. Okay. This comes from an article on the American Psychological Association, Why We Believe Alternative Facts. And I'm really just going to go kind of to the end of the article here, which is The key question is not why do you disagree with science, but rather why do you want to disagree with science? Answering that will probably require doing something people in our increasingly polarized political climate are loath to do. Less talking, more listening. Right? One of the most important ways to inoculate people from false information is to befriend them.
Right.
There is a time for the middle finger, and there's a time to put it away.
The Ecclesiastes. You can make an addition to Ecclesiastes. There's a time for the middle finger. This is also just basic Dale Carnegie, how to win friends and influence people.
Yeah.
Right? Just like, don't be a dick, right?
Yeah.
And then also, I can sum that up a little bit in the phrase feels over reels, which it's a common thing, but often that is the case. It's feels over reels, right?
Yeah. So all of this basically to say that as I watch people having conflicts in the world, one thing that I have always wanted to be better at and develop personally is a really good skill for conflict resolution. And it's something that I've made a priority in my life. How do I go about doing that? Whether it's people are arguing in our Discord and I may need to step in. I don't always do that. I kind of try to let people settle their own disputes and whatnot, and figure it out. But when I have had to do that, what is the way that you go about that? How do you bridge gaps? How do you bring people together? How do you resolve conflicts without them escalating to some out of control place where we have the level of toxicity that exists currently for this topic about Japanese to English localization? What is going on, and how do we resolve this?
It's definitely something deeper than it seems on the surface, which is going to be alluded to here by Zakogdo. It's not just the things he's saying aren't it. It's in addition, it's many straws on a camel's back.
Right. So I really, really, really just believe in this principle that if I'm disagreeing with somebody and I see that there's maybe some escalation happening there, let's talk about this in person. Let's get on a call. Let's look into each other's eyes and talk about it. It's something I've been on here now for the last little while on the channel too. My last reading of Lord of the Rings, look your enemy in the eye and find compassion. Now, the whole reason I'm bringing all of this up is because when I announced that we were going to do this episode, reaching out to Zakogdo, there were some people who were expressing concern about platforming this kind of person. And lots of assumptions being made about his actual knowledge of Japanese or if he's just using machine learning, a lot of this kind of thing. And I want to acknowledge that there are certain people that I agree are not worth platforming. Like the person who's not going to approach a conversation in good faith. They have proven time and time again that they're not willing to do that. I would challenge the people who were calling Zakogdo this type of person. It's probably a little easier and not nearly as common for that to be true as we think it is.
Absolutely. Well, he sent us a 16-page document after you had reached out to him, and he's not who you thought he was.
No.
We'll just put it that way. It's not exactly what I was expecting. He's a smart guy. He's well thought out. He's got reasons why he believes this. He has his opinions, and we differ in areas. But he laid out, his thoughts in a way that was friendly, and he even he has some regrets that he expressed a little bit. Oh, I should have done this or not. He's self-reflective. He's just not the kind of person that a lot of people were afraid he might be. Yeah. And great. I think it turns out most people are. That's not the kind of person that you are afraid of when you're like, oh, don't talk to them.
This is why it's so important to do this. This is why it is so important to look a person in the eye and talk to them and do it in good faith and give them a chance.
Right.
Because we assume way too quickly this person's too far gone to be worth talking to. And I just do not believe that is the case.
Yeah.
More than 95% of the time that we may think it is.
That's probably true.
It is certainly true in this case. I a lot of people were also upset that he didn't agree to do a live interview.
There's so many reasons.
Yeah.
Why someone might not
and
do
again,
it.
These are all assumptions being made about the person. And if we're going to sit here and criticize those who are, writing these posts and kind of, as we might deem, flying off the handle about translators on X and saying you're making assumptions about the reasons for these changes and encouraging people not to make assumptions, we have to also encourage people not to make assumptions about why these people are so upset.
Totally.
And I just feel like in the only way to dispel those bad assumptions is to just literally talk to a person and do a lot more listening than talking. So I reached out to him on Twitter in a personal message, and I sent him a series of questions that were mostly centered on how do you feel we misrepresented you, or what ways have we ignored your major concerns or sort of maybe dismissed them? In what ways have we missed the point? And I just allowed him to respond. And so what we're going to do today is go through that.
Most of his.
Try to read as much of that as possible.
Yeah.
And I think what you'll find is that there's a lot more common ground. At least that's how I found.
Me too.
Than I originally thought. And I learned a lot of things I didn't know, and that is the point of the practice, right?
Yeah.
The point of the practice is I don't know everything. And even though I had an expert on the show to tell us about the process of localization, there's still things, there are still parts of the truth, as Hegel says, that you can find in those places that feel peculiar or strange or not the right places where that information should be.
Yeah.
It's really hard to get your mind to accept that I've got some holes here, and this person who I would typically see as an enemy has those bits I'm missing. And if we can let these people talk, because this is really at the crux of what I think a big part of the issue is and why escalation even happens in the first place. When people don't feel like their input is valued at all, when they feel constantly dismissed, constantly shown that what you have to say doesn't matter, you are dumb, you are a weeb, you are this or that, like your opinion doesn't matter. It's first of all, it's not true. Right? Like people have concerns and those concerns should be considered. Yeah. And not dismissed.
Obviously, a lot of people agreed.
Yes,
with the initial post that we were critiquing.
Right,
a lot of people agreed with it. That's why it went so widespread.
Right. So, the only way to sort of like keep this escalating to the point where it's at now is if we had given rightful time and consideration to the concerns. So that's what we're going to try to do today. That does not mean that we will necessarily agree with everything in this document. And there will probably be times where we offer rebuttals. Yes. And I would have rather had him here to respond live.
Yeah.
So what I've challenged us to do is rather than just rebut, if we feel the need to do that, rebut in the form of a question. Okay. Invite response to those rebuttals and make this into a discourse and a discussion, not into a debate or an argument. That is where I am coming from as the foundation of this conversation. And please know also, at the time of this recording, tomorrow, we will be recording again with Alexander O. Smith.
Yeah.
So there's a follow-up episode to this.
Yeah.
In which there's a lot more to the discussion.
We're just going to keep going.
He wants to respond to a lot of things that were sort of levied at him and go through some examples this time. Let's actually break down what the Japanese says and the English says, and is this accurate or not, and why. So we're going to go through more examples and things like that in that episode. At the time of recording, that's going to be recorded tomorrow. It will be released a week from when this goes live. Yeah. Does that make sense? I hope that at least establishes why I feel this is important.
Good.
And we'll get us going here. Now, I would like maybe for you, since you have learned a lot of languages and you have learned Japanese to a certain extent, to talk a little bit about Zakogdo's passion for Japanese and how he went about learning the language, because there are a lot of people who have put that in doubt, whether he even knows Japanese.
Yeah.
And so maybe you can kind of go through some of that and his learning methods. I believe he does know Japanese.
I do too, yeah.
I think it's quite clear he does, actually.
And to the extent that maybe some of what he did is easily replicable by just putting something into Google Translate. Gosh, man, if I was putting something out on Twitter too, I'd probably just run it through Google Translate as well. I wouldn't just rely. Like, here's the thing, man. Japanese is hard. Japanese is a really hard language. And he even kind of admits in this, like, hey, maybe the translators probably know Japanese better than me, right? But if I was going to be making a critical thread and all that stuff, I'd be double checking my work and be running it through the translate machine as well, even at the level that I speak Japanese. And so, anyways, even if that's what he did, that doesn't mean you don't speak it, right? He knew enough to be able to, find the right reference points in order to determine which pieces he felt were mistranslated and all that stuff. Whether or not the final translation was literally his personal translation or not is maybe less important to me, because Google Translate will give you a more literal translation most of the time.
Yeah.
And so that's just kind of how the machine works. One of the questions that we asked him was, how did he learn Japanese? And he said that he actually learned it through the AJAT method, all Japanese, all the time. It's a method that was big 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's not as big anymore. It is, I think it's been replaced a little bit by maybe like Stephen Krashen or like Matt vs. Japan had a YouTube channel where he kind of had his mass immersion approach, what he called it, which is basically just, it is all Japanese all the time, but it's a different kind of, step method than what people were using a while ago. Basically, he's saying he was just reading Japanese all the time. But in order for him to read it, he had to first learn the kanji. And he started learning kanji in isolation without context, just memorizing what the characters mean and all that stuff on an Anki deck. Anki is just like a flashcard thing. And he said that it was a bad way to do things, because studying Japanese kanji without context isn't as helpful as you would think. You would think, like in English, I'll just study the words and then, I just figure out how to use them later on. Japanese, you combine two kanji to make a word that sometimes has nothing to do with either kanji. It's really difficult. And kanji has some kanji have 10 readings, right? Each one has the onyomi or the kunyomi, but sometimes there's more readings even beyond that. Like some kanji just have tons of readings. And so you might memorize all of them, and it turns out 7 of them aren't even used anymore, and you just spend all that brain space memorizing those. Anyways, he memorized it in a bad way. However, he kind of rectified his error and went back into studying it more, and then he has been to Japan, is what he told us. He actually went there and was able to speak to people, and he felt that he was received kindly by the people in Japan. So he speaks Japanese. Probably about as well as I do, which is not as good as most translators or people who lived in Japan for a long time. But I wouldn't call that into question. He seems to know Japanese, and even in the examples he's given us across multiple different places, and even doing his own kind of, he gave us a little sentence that he translated 3 different ways. He knows Japanese. He knows it well enough to where that doesn't need to be called into question.
Yeah, agreed 100%.
Yeah.
So I wanted to bring that up first, just to quell that particular part of it. So my first question to him was, in consideration of the conversations that we've had on our channel, both the Unicorn Overlord video and now this conversation with Alexander Smith, what would you say is the biggest blind spot on our part? What part of your grievances are we missing or have failed to account for? And what's the biggest point we need to address in the conversation that we have not addressed? So he says, as a person firmly on the side that is against what I would consider a heavy-handed or overbearing localization, I think the blind spot from neutral sides like yours is that it's never been the case that people don't understand what localizers purport to do. So we spent a large portion of our conversation with Alex going over this,
being like, oh, you don't understand. Localizers are just meant to translate it into the culture, and and he's saying that dude, stop it. We know what localizers are supposed to do. We're having issues with how they're doing it.
Right.
Yeah.
So it can feel a little bit condescending.
Yeah. I think that was his point.
So, I think that's, a fair point to bring up.
Yeah.
The process of localization, I should, for the audio only listeners, make sure that I signal when I'm going back to his quote. So he's speaking here. The process of localization as it appears to a work is supposed to be taking that work, adapting it for cultural context, and providing the target audience with an equivalent experience. That, and he puts in quotes, equivalent experience is the most important aim, that any changes that might be made are being done in the name of conveying meaning as it would have come across to the original audience in the original culture. The grievance that I believe isn't being conveyed is that we aren't getting that. We get games coming out with localizations full of rewrites, with characters' personalities being warped, with dumb references or memes being added, with deliberate erasure of dialogue that could be considered sexist or otherwise problematic, regardless of whether it was supposed to come across as such in the original text. And what is certainly most common and pervasive, yet also the quietest and easiest to overlook, simple changes in tone. And that's before even getting into censorship outside of the field of just translation. We've got hundreds, if not thousands, of examples of this at this point. Here are some examples he brings up. Back to his quote. We've got people making inflammatory comments about deliberately translating things wrong just to piss people off who want faithful translations. We've got numerous instances of people in localization talking about targeting certain subjects like the portrayal of women or rewrites in localization. This is something that both of you actually raised as a possibility in response to one of the examples in the Unicorn Overlord video. We have companies like Nintendo and Bandai Namco outright admitting that they're asking their localization staff to tell them about such considerations while making their games so that they can be toned down in the development phase, affecting the Japanese releases as well. And what's especially topical at the moment is remasters or remakes censoring things that were in the originals, both in localization revisions and in the Japanese releases as well.
That is something more common.
Yeah.
Like very common. In fact, Silent Hill 2 remake that I played, it toned down quite a bit of, especially that one pyramid head scene. It's really hard to see now, and it cuts away very quickly. It's not like it was in the original game.
Okay. We have all of these examples where it's not just localizers trying to make a change because it makes sense to convey the right meaning in the target language that they're translating into. They are adding things in there that aren't in the original, or they're taking things out for the purpose of being
culturally sensitive.
Yeah. Or, for some kind of political agenda or whatever.
Right.
Now, before we even continue in this vein, I want to say that there's probably room for debate on all of those points, whether or not it is a political agenda. That's the reason the translator made that change. As a teaser for the Alexander O. Smith episode, we will be going through some of the Eiyuden Chronicle translation comparisons and showing how it is possible that if you are a person who is deeply in the world of culture war stuff online, like you're online a lot and you're reading all this and this is on the brain, so to speak, it could be easy to assume that's what the localizer meant when they put it this way.
Sure.
When in reality, if you aren't online, very involved in this, it could very easily be seen in a different context that does not lend to that. And so the assumption being made is quite possibly faulty there.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So I want to say that first, but I want to address the larger sentiment in saying that I have seen some instances of this, right? Both in the examples that he shared in Unicorn Overlord and whatnot, like the changes in tone, certainly. Changes in character, like we're warping their personalities a little bit. Now, to whether or not we agree that the degree of the change is worthy of like such sharp criticism is maybe something to be debated. But I at least want to say that I agree with the sentiment that if a translator is spitefully, because they don't like the work, they don't like something that exists in the work, they think that it's
they don't respect it.
If they disagree with some part of the content of the work that they're translating, and so they set out to change it because the content goes against their personal beliefs.
Right.
I don't agree that that is the job of a translator.
Right.
You should, at that point, I would think, decline to translate the
just
work.
Say, this isn't for me, I'll pass.
I believe that this content is harmful for whatever reason. I think it pushes bad stereotypes. I don't like what it's saying, and I don't want to be a part of bringing this to another audience. Right. I decline to do the work. That is, I agree, would be the right thing for a translator to do. There's no conflict of interest there.
No, but translators don't get paid that well.
That's
and
also
work is
sometimes maybe you're forced,
hit or miss. Yeah.
You don't have much of a choice. I think that's a perfectly valid thing to bring up.
And then people just grumble the whole time, translating something they hate.
Still, it's not your job.
Yes, absolutely.
It's
100%.
not your job to change it just
100%.
because you disagree with it.
Yeah.
This is what the person who created the story set out to say, and as contemptible as you may find it, as much as you disagree with it, it is not your job to change it. That is my position as well. That is where I would agree with this side of things.
Yeah, you can refuse to do it or do it right.
Yeah.
You don't just get to do it wrong because you don't like it.
Yeah. So it is also my experience that those examples are few and far between. I have not seen a lot of examples where I think that is happening.
We did some research, and it was not as easy as I thought it would be to find those examples. Yeah.
So
I think the bigger issue was less the rogue translators, as Alexander O. Smith mentioned, someone he knows put all of his friends' names into a game. But also, it's more the top-down kind of pressure on the translators to change things.
So that's exactly a good transitioning point. Yeah. I do think, as he talks about with the Nintendo and Bandai Namco thing here,
that's top-down.
That there are either the Western counterpart of the company, so Nintendo of America, in collaboration with Japan, or some kind of third-party consultant brought in by the company.
There are a lot of those,
to help us understand, hey, we're going to be bringing this product to this market.
Yeah.
What do we need to know in order to not offend this culture or whatever? Can you please enlighten us as to, what things maybe we should reconsider or change?
Right.
And that this is happening earlier and earlier in development while the game's being made. So that not only is this a change for the market it's going into, it's changed in the Japanese as well.
I see this as actually a very big problem. This might actually be his biggest, his best argument in this document. Because as we talked with Alexander O. Smith, he several times brought up, his friend who said, "What are you talking about? The original's right here. You can play the original if you feel that the translation's wrong. The original's still here. Like, the only reason you know it's wrong is because you have access to the original. Well, congrats. Just do that then, right? Learn Japanese, whatever. I know it's a high bar. But the idea is that the art still exists over here. You just need to maybe learn a language and to go play it, and you can still experience the art. It's still there. But what he's saying here is that no, the process of the game development is being changed before the game even hits shelves, even in Japan.
Yeah.
And that is a much bigger problem than afterwards the localization kind of screwed it up, but the original's still there. Now we don't even get the original of what the artists intended. We're getting some corporate, forcible, do this, don't do that, delete this, put this in there. And then you get the art form, right, as Americans want it, even in Japan. There's a parallel to this in the United States, where the market in China is a huge market for Hollywood movies, right? And so often, and this was a big deal, there was a moon landing movie made a while back where they decided that the planting of the American flag on the moon would not be allowed in Chinese cinemas. And so they took it out of the movie, but not just the movie that they sent to China. They took it out of the movie. Like the whole movie doesn't have that scene even in America, right? And so people were getting upset about that. Oh no, this is you're influencing the product before it even comes out. Like we don't care as much, what happens after we get the art. But once the art is made, if it's made with that stuff in it to begin with, then we never have access to the original art to begin with. You never got it to begin with. So, anyways, I think this is his best his best critique here that I agree with him the most.
Yeah.
On.
This is where the idea that is thrown around far too loosely, in my opinion, of bringing like the colonizer label into this discussion has happened. I have been called a colonizer in these discussions.
Me too.
So as silly as that is, and as extreme as that is, I think there is at least a basis here for that comparison. There is this idea that our Western values are being pushed on another culture.
Yeah.
I'm
sympathetic to that. I really am.
On a culture, too, that, as you have described in recent episodes with declining birth rates, has an issue where in order for its GDP to grow, it has to sell a lot of its product outside of its own country.
Yes. Yeah.
And so this is a concern for big companies whose markets are largely outside of Japan.
Yeah.
They make their biggest profits outside of Japan.
Yeah.
And so they are trying to be preemptive in making sure that their products don't offend those markets and that they can maintain their brand image correctly in those foreign markets. And that is changing how the art is made in the source country.
You know what's killing me lately? I've been, I have often talked in the past about how I watch a lot of Korean television. I don't anymore, at least not least because I'm no longer studying Korean. I'm learning Swedish now. But also because Korean television over the 15 years that I've been watching it has slowly evolved to be a lot less Korean and a lot more American. Let's say the American influences are obvious. It's more likely for me to watch a Korean show and to be like, oh, this is just like what we have in America. Whereas before it was like, this is Korean. This is different. It's unique. It's cool. It's got their culture in it. Now I'm seeing something that's that is clearly influenced by my own culture, and it's less interesting to me. And I've been seeing this happen. It's kind of happening all over the world. But yeah, this is one of the ways in which, the United States has really been pushing certain things around the globe, like, even just in the media that these other countries are now consuming. Yeah. But and I don't like it. I don't like it at all.
Understanding that people like Zakogdo have a deep passion and admiration for the Japanese culture. They kind of see this as cultural erasure from their art.
Yeah.
Right? And again, I think that there's truth to that sentiment.
I think so.
Right?
I've been seeing it. I have seen it before my eyes. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been happening.
So
undeniable.
As absolutely ridiculous as it was for this person to call me a colonizer, I can still...
And when you say this person, you're not talking about...
I'm not talking about Zakogdo. I'm talking about some random person.
Good.
I don't remember if it was on X or if it was on our own comment section or whatever.
Yeah.
Somewhere. Someone was calling me and Alex and probably you colonizers, right? As ridiculous and as untrue as that is, literally.
Right.
There is, again, this practice, like we're saying, of looking these people as close as we can into the eye and trying to listen to their concerns, where I go, you know what? I think there is some truth to that. I think there's a huge push in the West right now for cultural change, and a lot of that I agree with, by the way. And this can carry over into an overzealousness. And I'm not going to point to any examples. I'm being very general here. So I'm just trying, please take this in the spirit in which it's given, in a general sense, right? There are obviously going to be some examples to the contrary, and I'm aware of those. But what I'm saying in a general sense, there can develop an overzealousness to where you start to assume that your beliefs and your core values that you hold and that you're pushing for change in your own society must needs be accepted by cultures around the world. And this is where the colonizer mindset they're trying to refer to with that word is coming from. In the same way that, you know, European countries went all around the world and literally colonized them and brought their religion to these, and you know, people who lived there originally, these indigenous people, and forced it upon them. This idea that we are taking these sort of cultural values that we're advocating for or pushing for change on, and trying to like force other people, whether
the U.S. State
intended
Department
for that or
this.
not in their art that they created, we're going to put those values in there anyways.
Yeah.
Again, even when I agree that these are important changes to make in the culture, it's still not right to put that message into someone else's story that did not intend to do that.
I remember talking about this in Nier.
In our original Nier replicant Gestalt analysis, we talked about this with that little, what's the city, where all the people wear the masks and they have all the rules and stuff.
Yeah.
We talked all about that there.
It's like, oh, we got to change them. We got to change it. They're doing it wrong. Yeah.
Yes.
And it's like, you may believe that, but let them decide their own future.
Yes.
Don't force things upon other people against their will.
Right. So, anyway, I very much believe we will bring this topic up again in our next follow-up.
Yes,
and there is plenty of room for further detail and discussion and context to be added to that.
Yeah.
But I want to say that at the very least, the sentiment, the underlying sentiment and concern is one that I can understand and to a certain extent agree with.
Sure. Yeah, me too.
Now, whether in practice I would agree in certain cases, I'm a very much a case-by-case basis type of guy, right?
That's so hard, though, because how many cases are there?
Right.
Billions?
That's the thing, is you can't generalize too much, even though I am talking in generalities.
Right. We only got like an hour.
Generalities are meant to be like, okay, here's like the baseline guideline.
Yeah.
But there are going to be examples where, okay, we should consider this in this context and maybe it's different. So I'm not trying to like blanket apply this to everything. I'm just trying to say I sympathize with that general sentiment. If I admire a certain culture for A, B, and C reasons, and then I see people trying to take pieces of that culture and in bringing it over here, try to like change what's being done to erase certain parts of that culture and make it feel more like this culture over here, or adhere to their rules and guidelines and whatnot. I can see that as being presumptive, condescending, and sort of an air of we are better than you.
Yes, it's an elitist kind of attitude. Yeah, I hate it too, and that's what I'm talking about with the Korean television. It's like it's actually hard for me to watch that stuff now, which is really sad. I really used to enjoy that. Luckily, there's a ton of stuff made 15 years ago. I can just keep consuming that. But, as far as the new stuff, it's clearly American influence. It's really sad. It's really sad.
Homogenization going on there.
Yes. Right? Everything's kind of melding into the same gray, goop that. And
at that point, like, there is no culture. It's all just the same thing.
Yes,
that's what
the erasure of culture. Yeah, exactly.
That's what makes visiting other cultures and learning about other cultures such an enriching experience. Is that they are so different from you and the way that you think and the way that and you're not always going to agree with it, but those differences.
It's good that you don't.
Yeah,
you shouldn't always agree with it.
Sure,
because what, are you right all the time?
Right, exactly.
You shouldn't. There should be tons of things that people do that you don't agree with. And instead of trying to change it so that everything aligns with you, like, be cool with it and maybe accept it and maybe try to learn from it.
Yeah. Like exactly what Hegel was talking about, right? With you're going to find in there, even though initially you might strongly think otherwise, you're going to find things in there that will poke the holes in your own beliefs. So I'm going to read this last paragraph of the first part.
Okay.
Generally speaking, I also need to address something about what you see in translation comparisons often. What you tend to get is the original language text, the official localized text, and then an extremely literal, dry translation of the original text to compare to. He's talking about how we talked about, in these comparisons, the text that we're seeing from him, for instance, is so dry and without personality that wouldn't work, right? So he's responding to that. This is what I've often done as well. People tend to misunderstand these as indicating that dry literal translation is exactly how things should be, and anything indicating, sorry, I skipped forward. Anything else is wrong. But that's not really the case. The idea is just to directly translate the original text in order to demonstrate what the meaning was, and then contrast it with whatever the other translation is including to demonstrate the difference. So that's something I think people on the localization side of the debate often overlook when talking about translation comparisons that people make. They aren't meant to be the final take. They're just illustrating the differences between the original meaning and whatever it has been changed into. So he's not saying my translation here is what should be the final translation.
He's just saying here's what the Japanese technically says.
What it technically says versus what they put.
Which I also have to bring in the caveat. That is not what the Japanese technically says. What it technically says is something crazy that doesn't make sense in English.
I think we're going to get into that. This is also a teaser.
We can do that next time? Okay, next time.
Teaser for next time.
That'll be fun.
But very quickly, one of the most important things I've learned in learning Portuguese is that my brain was trained to take these foreign words and say, that word means this.
Yep. 1-to-1.
That word means this. That word means this.
Yeah.
And literally, that's never true.
Right.
That word does not mean what my English approximation or closest equivalent is. Yeah. It means whatever that foreign word means. There's a culture around how that word was created.
Mm-hmm. There's a story behind each word.
Yes.
And it's a different story.
And so me thinking this means this, no, it literally doesn't.
Yeah.
I can't be thinking that way. I have to get into thinking in Portuguese and thinking through the lens of their culture to understand what that word really means.
Got to become Catholic.
Probably. Anyway,
like the word adios, just to give one example. Adios means to God.
It does not mean goodbye.
Well,
it means to
however,
God.
The old way of saying goodbye was something like "God be with you." That's but what we don't say.
They probably share that root.
Yeah, God is
in
there
the
somewhere.
Original meaning.
Yeah, but to God and God be with you aren't even the same thing either. It's just.
I was going to pull up some examples, but I'm saving that for next time. We're not going to dive into that.
We don't even say goodbye anymore. We just say bye.
Yes,
it's like that doesn't mean anything.
It doesn't mean the same thing.
Yeah.
Whether or not we're using it in a similar way or whether this is a close approximation of it, sure. But it does not mean that.
Yeah.
And you got to stop thinking of languages in this framework that this word means this, what my English mind has created for that concept.
Yeah. And what's crazy is that as close as English and Portuguese are, which isn't that close, but it's kind of close, Japanese is a whole different ball.
Way different.
So much more different than English to Portuguese. So. Yeah, it's really something.
Second question, what was it?
The second question here is, how have we misrepresented you, Zakogdo, specifically in our videos? He calls me out a few times, so it's good that I'm reading this one. I can be a little, I can be less than polite sometimes, I suppose. What context are we missing? What clarifications would you like to make about your positions? So now Zakogdo responds, for me specifically, I can really only talk about the Unicorn Overlord video. I'll start by trying to provide some context. Before I made the Unicorn Overlord thread, I was mostly just posting about the censorship issues and sharing comparisons that other people had already made. I didn't think any of my own translations had ever gotten more than a few thousand views at most. I was basically just making observations on things that I'd found and sharing them with people who knew and already shared my views, and I didn't need to explain myself to. So he was basically just like complaining to some friends on a public forum.
Preaching to the choir.
Yes.
Right.
But in a public place.
Sympathize to this so much because it has happened to us a lot of times before.
Totally.
Where we thought we're making this video and it's only going to get about, it's for this group of people that we kind of already garnered.
They know
what we're talking about. You can tend to when you think you're in a certain setting, right, where you're surrounded by people who agree with you, and
you talk differently.
You know that they know what you mean, so you can tend to maybe exaggerate or say something in a way that's just a venting of frustration, not meant to be taken literally by the word, and they'll get it, right, because they share the same frustration. But then if somebody outside that listens to it, it is quite obvious that what you're saying is dumb, right? But it's not meant to be taken literally. It's just a venting.
So happens to us all the time.
Whether that's literally in not exactly the same context, but we've maybe made a video or talked about a topic in such a way to where we figured our audience understands where we're coming from when we say that. But then there are people outside of it, or maybe it ends up getting shared to some other place on a Reddit forum that we didn't anticipate. And all of a sudden we get all these people jumping down our throats. And it's like, oh, dudes, if I had known you were going to be listening to that, I would have said it this way. And that's not, I want to clarify, that's not an exercise of, well, this is what I really feel, but I would have said it this way. It's I really feel this way, but within a certain group, I don't have to be so concise in how I articulate it.
Hashtag not all. Right? It gets exhausting to always be doing that. Sometimes you just say it and you don't need to hashtag not all.
Because these people know I don't mean that when I say this.
Right,
I'm just frustrated and they're frustrated and we're venting together. I would hope most people understand and have had that experience or something similar to it. So I really sympathized with this. He did not mean for this Unicorn Overlord thread to be seen by millions of people.
No, he did
to
not.
have people like Yasumi Matsuno comment on it, to be picked up by all these different websites, to be picked up by people like us to criticize it, to be picked up by people who are better at Japanese than him, who could then criticize his translations.
Yeah, criticizing him.
Right? So I sympathize with that. But I also, in having gone through that, I know how important that painful experience is because it causes you to self-reflect. And I really believe that I have seen a change in the way Zakogdo approaches, and he's even said this to me in our back and forth. I've changed the tone a little bit with which I do my critiques. Because of something like this. You realize the world's a lot bigger than this little choir that you're preaching to, and that there's a lot of holes in the things that you thought you knew or that you thought you were proficient at. And to a smaller degree, this happened a little bit with our video with Alexander O. Smith. It wasn't nearly as big as his thread was. It wasn't seen by millions of people, but certainly got shared among groups of people who don't agree with us.
I noticed that, yes. I read the comments.
And so this is the response. The response is, okay, let me reach out to Zakogdo directly. Let's talk. Let's see where our holes exist, and hopefully he's been doing that too. And this is how we grow, right, as people.
This is good, and especially as I read more of what he says here. I could have said things differently too. We'll just put it that way. Okay, so then he says, this is Zakogdo speaking now. So I made the Unicorn Overlord thread, preaching to the choir as usual, not expecting anything more to come of it than usual. Then I woke up the next morning, and it had over 1 million views, and that number just kept going up. Suddenly, there were all sorts of eyes on it outside of my usual sphere. People from outside the localization discourse seeing it, gaming websites running articles on it, people from academia analyzing my translations and finding issues with them, podcasts like yours lambasting me for making a mountain out of a molehill. I even got a couple of people calling for violence against me over it. And the biggest surprise to me, of course, was that even the legendary Yasumi Matsuno noticed it. I don't know. Sorry. I want to talk to Zakogdo. I really do.
I do too.
What was it like for your childhood hero to greet you in such a manner? Like
Yasumi Matsuno, I don't think ever criticized Zakogdo.
He didn't.
Directly.
He brought up a good point,
He
though.
just kind of like added context of, hey, are we considering here that the Japanese developers requested these changes of the localization? I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, Matsuno didn't say that.
I understood that, but maybe they didn't.
I know. This is so sad. Man, I would just... It would make me sad. That might be the only time that you get to interact with Yasumi Matsuno, you know?
Sure.
Just another reason to maybe keep things, But Yasumi Matsuno never would have commented if he was being maybe more polite in his discourse. It never would have gone viral.
Yeah.
That never would have happened. So
here's something I really wanted to point to, and this is huge, 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 huge for me. A lot of people have harassed or unfairly mischaracterized the translator based on some research that Zakogdo originally released about this person's history and approach to translation. I just want to point out that Zakogdo has said here that he has had people call for violence against him.
Yeah.
Right? You know how that feels now. I have also had that happen to me.
Me too. Many times, actually. Many times. Multiple ways.
So there's one part of me that's like, if you're gonna put your work out there in the world, there's just gonna be some crazy people who are gonna say some really messed up stuff to you.
Yeah, just assume like 1% of the world wants to kill you.
That's part of the game, so to speak, if you're gonna get involved. I'm not justifying it. There's no justification for it.
Right.
It has happened to me. It never feels good.
Right.
The point is, Zakogdo also had this happen to him. So he got a taste of some of that harassment himself.
Right.
Right. So for all the people who are sitting here, you shouldn't platform this person. This person is responsible for translators being harassed and all this kind of thing. He's also been harassed. And so I pose this as a question to you, Zakogdo. Hopefully you're watching this. Now that you have had a taste of that kind of harassment, do you feel that you have had some role in the tone with which you've approached talking about this, in lighting a flame underneath some very toxic people who have then gone over to Brian and to other translators and started sending them death threats, calling for violence against them, when in fact they're not maybe even the ones responsible for the changes? We're going to get into this a little bit later in the document. Yeah. Zakogdo was approached by a translator on a project who appealed to his bosses, please do not change this line. And he was overruled.
Yep.
So it was not the translator going rogue to make the change.
Yeah,
he was advocating for being more faithful. It was the marketing people and people over the top who said, no, according to our market research or whatever, this is insensitive and we should change it.
Right.
And it wasn't until complaints began to come in
after release,
and the translator took that to the bosses and said, look at all the complaints. They said, you know what? Yeah. Maybe in the future, you're right. We'll try to be more faithful in translations. Don't attack the wrong person. And this is going to be a big thread, probably both in this, but maybe even more so in the next episode we do, the follow-up to this. If we want to address a problem, we have to properly diagnose the problem. And a lot of people are not doing that. They're going after the wrong person. Yeah. and a lot of times this is more an example of a higher up marketing corporate decision, like Nintendo of Japan wanting to be informed while they're making the game, hey, are we doing anything that might be culturally insensitive here? We should change it while we're working on it. And they have a third-party consulting company or Nintendo of America or whatever coming in and consulting on that very thing. Right? So some people are saying, I don't care who it is that's making these changes. I just don't want the change to be made.
Just stop the changes. Yeah.
Very well. But don't attack the wrong person.
Right.
Don't go send death threats at all. But definitely don't attack the wrong person.
Right.
And so, again, bringing it back to Zakogdo here, is the tone that you're taking, I'm asking this in totally good faith to you, and I'm not asking you to answer me, I'm asking you to rhetorically consider this. When you are writing your threads and you're writing your criticism, are you considering that this is lighting a flame underneath the people who are going to go do some real damage and harassment to someone else? And now that you've experienced that, are you thinking about that? Right?
Very good.
Go ahead.
Okay, and then he said, oh shoot, I already read all that. All of this because the algorithm picked up this thing that I made that I never imagined would get as big as it did, and so I never put any thought into how to convey what I felt the issues with it were to people totally unfamiliar with this topic. And these problems that I'd been seeing for years up to this point. And it didn't help that I removed one post in the middle of which that made X decide it no longer wanted to show the second half of the thread to people. So he kind of cut the thread, which there's 2 threads now.
Oh, right.
So he removed a piece of the thread, which makes it not a thread now, and now it's 2 threads. And then people don't ever get to see half of his argument. In that way, my inexperience with X's formatting really hurt too. I still think there's a lot to criticize about Unicorn Overlord's localization, but if I were to do it again now, I'd approach that thread completely differently. So to clarify, I have 2 general problems with Unicorn Overlord's localization based on what I was able to analyze at the time of the demo. The first is that it uses a stylized classical English script when the Japanese is standard modern Japanese. This is the majority of what we talked about before.
Yeah,
right?
and I also want to say there's probably not much point in diving into that.
Yeah.
Because I think on this point, we just philosophically disagree with him.
Yeah.
I am totally fine with change, though we are going to clarify a little later that I totally respect his reason for being against this fancifying of or stylizing of dialogue for like a period appropriate kind of thing. So if we're talking about a medieval European inspired fantasy setting, he is against using language that sort of like reflects that time period in the translation. He's against that.
Right.
I am not. I am all for it.
Me too.
Right? And that's because for me, the important part here is that the language be a part of reinforcing the setting.
Yes,
and that I really enjoy beautiful language. And I happen to believe that English has degraded heavily from about the 1950s till now.
Yes.
And that language, even just from like Tolkien's period, was so much more beautiful than now. So I appreciate older, elevated forms of English far more than modern parlance. I just don't like our modern colloquialisms, our slang from today. That takes me out of a setting in which has knights and these, wizards and magic and these sorts of things. I don't like hearing TikTok language.
Very nice.
In that setting. It takes me out 100%. I just don't like it.
Yeah,
so,
me too, I agree.
But his reasons for that, which we'll get into later, I totally respect. Yeah. So we shouldn't spend too much time on number 1.
Yeah.
We just disagree philosophically on this point.
Exactly. And then he says the second is that it rewrites, Unicorn Overlord, it rewrites dialogue needlessly and warps characterization in the process. You guys were actually pretty accepting of the examples that I had on the latter in your video, so I don't think I need to go into other ones that you didn't feature. On the other hand, Kaysen absolutely ripped into me over the first point throughout the video based on my introduction to that point saying this. One of my most persistent issues with the localization is the endless attempts of the English script to fancify dialogue, typically at the expense of accuracy. In a stroke of unparalleled genius, I paired that post with several examples where the localization really wasn't any less accurate, it was only stylized. That was a huge mistake on my part.
This was unfortunate because most of our Unicorn Overlord video was focused on pointing out how these are not inaccurate translations. Because he made the mistake of saying, at the expense of accuracy, they fancified dialogue. And then he showed like a bunch of examples in a row where they were not inaccurate because of the fancified dialogue.
We were able to more or less just rebut his thesis based on, but what really he had other complaints really. And if we kept going longer and further, we would have gotten to his real complaints.
We eventually became somewhat fatigued by just repeating the same thing. Like, that's not inaccurate. That's not inaccurate. That's not inaccurate. That's not inaccurate. So go ahead.
He says that was a huge mistake on my part, and it's understandable that between that and the other things I've mentioned, that your Unicorn Overlord stream took the tone that it did. One thing I want to complain about is one particular comparison which was featured in the video. In a comparison of a scene of Lex and Elaine talking about Scarlet, Kaysen and Mike only read the first few lines and then moved on rather than reading the full scene. Kaysen said, I'm going to say it like myself, He just doesn't like being poetic. That's what I said. This was actually one of the examples where I believed that the attempts to fancify dialogue damaged the intent of the writing, because it's a scene where Elaine is agitated over his worry about Scarlet, who had been kidnapped, to the point that he briefly snaps at Lex. By the way, we'll get into this in a bit.
We will.
He briefly snaps at Lex, causing Lex to recoil. The localized line of Elaine snapping, which you guys didn't even get to, fluffs up his dialogue so much that the sense of agitation is unquestionably diminished. To demonstrate this, here is a clip from the scene in question in the Japanese and English, and an updated translation from me. So he then posts the translation.
We're gonna put this on the screen.
Okay, very good.
Screen grab here so everyone knows what we're looking at.
So for this one part here, he highlights, so we read the first few lines, but then we stopped before this particular line, which is very important. In the Japanese, it says, so wa ittemo da na, which means, I know that, but ... And Zakogdo put an exclamation point there. I'm gonna quarrel with him about that. But then in the English, what is put there, Elaine says, instead of what in the Japanese would be, I know, but it is, perhaps yet the danger to Scarlet grows with each grain passing through the hourglass. That is different. I have to give it to Zakogdo. He's right about that.
Completely right about this example. Yeah. Completely right. The tone of this is so different.
Yeah.
That I agree. I do not agree with this translation. I think this should not have been done this way.
I hope. I like to think that were we to have gotten there, I would have agreed with him even when we first read this.
Original
because these aren't the same at all. Everything else we've been pointing to, it's a more poetic way. Oh, are these using metaphors or some other way, some other comparisons to make his point. With this one, it's just so basically what happens here is that Elaine is like struggling with something in his mind and is unable to articulate it. That's the whole point here. I can't articulate it, but.
Yes.
And then
extremely articulately.
He's extremely articulate, very flowery in his dialogue, and says what I would assume precisely what he was feeling in metaphor. But the real line was, "Yeah, I know. It's just that I don't know. I don't know what to say. I'm struggling here. That's the real feeling. What was supposed to come across here did not come across at all in the translation. So Zakogdo is right.
He's completely right about this example, and this is also something I believe strongly about the role of localization. Right? You should be trying to translate the intent or idea of what's being said, not the words, because the words are different in the culture.
Yeah, totally.
And this is an example where the idea of the expression being made by the character was not translated.
Yeah. Yeah, it was not translated.
It's actually...
Translation failed.
It's not so far removed that it's completely different.
I would say that as well.
But it is different enough to where it changes how you are viewing the way the character is feeling.
Yeah.
The character here is struggling to articulate.
Yes.
And in this version, he's articulating perfectly.
Perfectly just fine. And in fact, they're like playing a little game of conceits and quips and metaphors when it's like this isn't the time for that. This isn't the time when anyone would be doing that. Like, let me think of a great metaphor to convince you. No, it's like this is like something serious is happening.
Yes.
And they don't have time for that. Right?
Yes.
So hats off.
Now,
Zakogdo's right about that.
There is one aspect that we want to nitpick a little bit on his translation here.
Yeah, because he said, I know that, but ... which is the Japanese so wa ittemo da na. I looked up the way this was delivered in the Japanese.
We're talking about the original Japanese text box.
Yes.
It says which words?
So wa ittemo da na.
And then it has it has an ellipses, 3 dots after that.
Yeah.
Now, continue.
Okay. Well, Zakogdo in his translation put an exclamation point there, and even earlier on, he called it an outburst.
An outburst, or
he's like snap. He says he's
snapping or yelling at.
Now, so wa ittemo da na. That's not an outburst. That's not a snap, and it does not warrant an exclamation point. So even in Zakogdo's kind of rendering of this is what it really should have said, I take issue with the way that he put it too. It wasn't a snap. It wasn't such a retort. It shouldn't have an exclamation point at the end. It was just I know, but like I'm powerless. I'm deflated. I don't feel right. I can't think. I don't know what's going on. I'm just worried. I don't think his translation got that, super perfectly either. But it's better than the waxing poetic
than what we got in the official localization.
Exactly.
It's closer to the original meaning than that. But even still, I think you would have a disagreement with his translation there because it's also not quite accurate.
It's not accurate enough to the spirit of the original
of what the original
Japanese
character was feeling.
Yes, which
he's not snapping at Lex. He's expressing frustration at himself for not knowing what to do.
Right, exactly. So anyways, then there's another scene before this where Lex says something like, using a play on the idea that Rome wasn't built in a day. This is a common phrase, right? Anything that takes a long time to do, you say, well, Rome wasn't built in a day. Get working on it. Start, like people say, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. These are common metaphors that in English people use. And so when they're trying to translate it into this fantasy world, they change the metaphor a bit, but keep the idea as it's presented, at least in the United States. So he says that Grand Corinne, here's the line right here. He says, I don't like the Grand Corinne line, which is, you've done plenty. Look, oh wait, no, that's not it. Oh, here it is. Yeah, like that's the healthy way to think about it. Grand Corinne wasn't built in a day, And Grand Corinne being one of the big cities of the world of...
By the way, I agree with this too. Rome doesn't exist in this world. No. And so that phrase, I know they didn't say Rome, but that phrase, which developed in this world's sort of like linguistic evolution, would not have evolved the same way in this one. Well,
it might have.
It might have. What I'm saying is...
I don't mind it, but I'll let you talk.
Technically, you're correct.
Right.
But using that phrase, which is a part of our world, what that does is make me think Western. Of Rome wasn't built in a day.
Right.
Which makes me come out of this world and think of this world we're in.
Yeah, Earth.
Which I think is kind of my whole problem.
So it's a little fourth wall-y breaking.
With, you need to use language that, so here's my two highest priorities.
You've moved me, actually. I'm actually slowly starting to agree with you.
Here are my two major priorities in what I think are the most important thing for a localization to be done well. Number one, you're not beholden to the words that are written. You are beholden to what is that character trying to express? What is the core idea? Because the words they use in that language to express that may sometimes be the same, but oftentimes they will not.
And almost
so if we just translate the same words, he's not saying the same thing in this culture. So we have to, first of all, understand the meaning, the intention that those words are meant to convey.
Yeah.
We translate that sentiment, not the words.
Sure.
Right? That's not what happened in the cases that we've shown here. No. Number two is to use language that keeps us rooted, immersed in the story, that does not bring us out into our world. Yeah. And this is what he brought up earlier with like memes and things like that.
Being inserted.
Inserted into, this is like a funny meme on the internet today. We're going to like reference that in this other world. That doesn't have this. It doesn't have TikTok. You know what I'm saying? So that's important to me. Don't use language that calls back to our world if we're in a fantasy world. Use language that roots us even more into believing in this world. And that phrase, while not like the biggest offender of all time, I'm not going to read that, and I didn't when I played Unicorn Overlord and go, oh, God, I hate that. I read through it and whatever. But I would have rather considered, hey, let's not use the reference, Rome was not built in a day, in a totally different universe.
Rome out of it.
Yeah, because all that's going to do is call to our world.
They should have said, like, Grand Corinne wasn't built in a week or a fortnight or,
Yeah.
Just kidding. Like, maybe. Is that enough? At what point is it too different?
There's other ways to communicate the sentiment that things don't happen quickly.
Grand Corinne wasn't built...
It takes a while to do things sometimes.
There you go. Just say that.
You don't. That's not great either.
No, you have
that's
to say,
the sentiment. That's what I'm getting at. That's the sentiment. That's the meaning they're trying to get across. You know, greatness is not accomplished quickly, right? Say that in a different way that doesn't call to our world.
It taketh much longer time in order to doeth things that other people thinketh in mere moments. Okay, that would have been way better. Just kidding. What about Grand Krim wasn't built in 2 days? Is that good? Are we good now? Is that a good middle road? Okay, so he says, then back to Zakogdo. I don't like the Grand Krim line for injecting a real-world saying into a fantasy setting with just a flat replacement of the location, but the other lines are really just here for context. It's that line of Elaine snapping the moment where he loses his cool by Elaine's standards. Okay, you know what? When I'm saying, oh, he didn't snap, that wasn't snapping, I'm kind of saying that Zakogdo, I don't know Elaine that well. It's possible that this was snapping by Elaine's standards. He kind of softens it here. So that makes me kind of, okay, I'll take what I had said previously. Maybe by Elaine's standard, this was snapping. Not by anyone else's standards. But maybe Elaine always keeps his cool, and that just admitting you don't know something, okay, maybe, I don't know. But he softened it here a little bit.
I want to bring something up. We have David in our chat here for our live chat, our Patreon live chat for these recordings. He works in localization.
Yeah, he's a translator.
He does Spanish localization.
From Japanese.
He has worked at Nintendo. And he says, we had conversation about this at Nintendo. I said this before, but I got this from, hold on.
The bottom line is really good. The
I got this from Jesus Angel Rodriguez Gago, the lead Spanish translation at Nintendo of Europe.
Yeah.
And so what he said was, a good translation doesn't use cultural references. It creates new cultural references. This is exactly my point.
Yes.
This is exactly my point.
I like that. Every now and then I read a new cultural reference in a game where I'm just like, that's brilliant. Like they came up with a new saying just for this game.
Yes.
So cool.
That's world building.
Yeah, it's so good.
That's world building.
Yeah.
Don't say the thing the way we would say it.
Yes.
Say it in a way that creates a unique cultural reference for the world you're building.
I like that. I like that a lot.
That to me
it's harder to do.
Is a big priority for how you word things and the language that you use to get across, again, the underlying sentiments and ideas the characters are trying to convey, not using the exact same words that they used.
Yes.
That, to me, is a mark of good localization.
I like it. Thank you, David, for sharing that. It's really good. Yes, I want to say this again. That's just so good. A good translation does not use cultural references. It creates new cultural reference. That is that is hard to do. It's difficult to do, but anyone can do that. Anyone that can do that is worth $1 million in translation world, in my opinion. I think that's a very valuable skill if you can do that. Okay, so he says that Elaine needs to be more curt and, snappy than it is in the official localization, and that's exactly the kind of problem I had wanted to highlight. Of course, I take issue with him there, but that's fine. That you guys dismissed what was a comparison of a particular scene based on not finding anything wrong with the introductory lines included for context is a case where I will say I did feel misrepresented. Though I do understand why you had checked out by that point. I failed to properly structure and explain things and just assumed people would know where the problems I was seeing were. So that's on me. I had wanted to go over the full game as well, but over a month had passed before my copy had even shipped, let alone arrived, and by that time Eiyuden Chronicle had reared its ugly head, so Unicorn Overlord got put on the back burner. For now, it's still sitting in my drawer in its plastic wrap. So he didn't end up playing the game. But that's the end of that.
That's the end of that one.
Question 2.
So, I feel like we've had some understanding here.
I have to just say something real quick. I like Zakogdo.
I do too.
I think it's cool. I
do too, right?
Okay.
Here was my third question to him. What points have we or Alex made that you would like to rebut? He says, I think the primary one is that I fundamentally disagree with the idea that it's appropriate to take a game written in modern colloquial vernacular in a source language and transform it into stylized, period-appropriate vernacular in localization. That isn't attempting to create an equivalent experience. It's a transformative one. So this is where I was alluding to earlier. I respect his reason here, but I just fundamentally disagree with it.
Yeah, me too.
And that's okay. That's okay. We're just going to disagree on that, but I do want to at least air fairly his reason for thinking this.
Okay.
It's taking a foreign work. Okay, sorry. Zakogdo is speaking again. It's taking a foreign work and thinking that because it would fit a particular style with association with Western works in similar settings, that we should transform it accordingly. Both of you raised points about how the well-spoken parlance of the knights would fit the education they'd have received, or how the use of analogy and metaphor from other characters could be associated with their lived experiences. That if we associate that with our own history, that we could draw parallels and extrapolate information about the setting from there. There's also the point that when anyone speaks in flowery language, that it doesn't make any one character stand out as a result, and I would agree with that assessment. But this isn't a Western work. It wasn't made in English, and it isn't about Western history. It's a medieval fantasy game set in a world that was inspired by Western history and fiction from the perspective of the Japanese development team. Kaysen raised that they wouldn't write such a story in classical Japanese because it'd be thematically incongruent. Right. But I think that only strengthens the point of it being a foreign experience. It's something that is inherently different to our own Western fiction. So why should we appropriate it and try to present it as if it was something that had been created by us and in line with our expectations of how such a work should be?
I love what he's saying. I love it. But I do have one issue with it, and it is his earlier point of equivalent experience. To create an equivalent experience, that does have to be done. Equivalent experience, meaning I am experiencing a game as if it was made for me, by my culture, for my culture, and I'm just playing a game, right? I don't even know where let's say I don't know that Nintendo's based in Kyoto, Japan. This company called Nintendo made a game, and I'm playing it, and it feels like it was made for the culture that I sit in, because the game that Nintendo made for Japanese people felt that way to the Japanese people. So an equivalent experience argument would necessitate that those foreign elements be removed. I think I think there are ways in which he's presenting multiple arguments here, and I like that. I like just present all the arguments, and sometimes things fit better into one than another. He's ultimately going to present, I think, 4 different arguments for how things ought to be localized. But my point is that they don't all resolve very well.
They're not congruent
with each other. They kind of cancel each other out a little bit. Yeah, because if you want the equivalent experience in America as the Japanese got from their Japanese developer making their game, you need to make the game appear as though it were made by a Western developer, because equivalent experience. Unless you're going to say, well, okay, maybe not equivalent experience because we're actually going to experience the other. Let's keep the Japanese stuff in there. That makes it not an equivalent experience because the Japanese didn't have a foreign experience in their game. Yeah. I agree with what he's saying. It's just they're 2 points that are difficult to reconcile, I think. And this is the difficulty of translation, like right here. And we're going to get into a few more, I think, a little bit later on, of how hard it is to actually meet that point for everyone.
Right. Again, I'm repeating myself at this point, but I respect this
Me too.
reason.
I like it.
I see where you're saying
more
that
culture, please.
This might undercut his earlier explanation of what localization should be.
Yeah.
Because you're saying, it's not creating equivalent experience if the Western version is full of foreign stuff, Japanese stuff. I get what you're saying.
Yeah. But it's good because Japanese is dope.
But I think what we should really take away from this is that Zakogdo's true feeling is that if you're going to experience a foreign work, you should be trying to understand the foreign understanding,
I agree.
The culture, the mindset behind how they made it, and not wanting to change that to fit your expectations. And
I agree. Marketing departments disagree, but I agree.
There is actually a large part of that I do agree with.
No.
So when I watch foreign films, I like to listen to it in the source language with subtitles.
Good man.
Right? But if I'm going to sit there and watch that with my family, my father in particular does not want to, quote unquote, read the movie.
He doesn't want to get over the 2-inch barrier. What is the Korean, the guy, he won the Academy Award for, the host or whatever that, Anyways, he said, if you guys can get over the 2-inch barrier of reading subtitles, there's a whole world of movies open to you. Yeah.
That's exactly how I feel. And so for anyone who cares about learning about other cultures, who finds exploring other cultures fascinating, I am one of those people.
Yeah.
I have now been to cultures or countries around the world for my work.
Lots.
And that has been by far my favorite part of it.
Yeah.
Experiencing their culture, learning about their attitudes.
You've been to Asia,
and
South
feelings.
America, and Europe?
I've been to Europe.
Like
I've been
all over.
to Asia. I've been to South and Central America, to multiple countries within each region.
Yeah, so that's so cool.
And
I'm jealous.
that is something that I find extremely valuable because I'm a person who likes to be self-reflective. I'm a person who likes to go, well, in my culture, we had these and these and these values. I come here and come into contact with these and these and these values, and I go, some of these are better.
Sure.
Some of them aren't, or maybe that's my opinion or whatever.
Well, better is culturally defined as well, but yes. Totally.
But the point is, I feel like I grew as a person because I came in contact with a bubble outside of the culture I grew up in. And I realized, hey, there's actually some problems in my culture now that I think about it.
Yeah.
And maybe we should make some changes here or there. Or maybe I should personally, in my own moral landscape, make some changes here or there or whatever.
Right.
Right? I think that's a hugely important thing for people to do. And so it comes across as a little bit shallow to me when a person has no desire to overcome that 2-inch barrier and to learn about another culture and just to get used to the sounds of their language.
It doesn't take much for me to hear another language and then just want to learn it.
I literally
so cool.
know almost zero Japanese, zero Korean, and zero Chinese. But if you play those languages to me, I know the differences in how they sound.
Yeah.
And even that, I think, is important.
Sure.
To not be able to go,
or to see
what's
it
this
written
Chinese, blah, blah, and then it's actually a Korean person or whatever. Oh, they all look the same, all these stereotypes. Right? Yeah. Doing even just the bare minimum to be able to distinguish between cultures is important.
I think it is.
So when I watch a foreign film, I'm watching that in the source language with English subtitles so I can understand the movie.
Right.
But some people don't want to do that. They just want to hear their own language spoken back at them. And so the real source of the debate here shouldn't, well, we would all hope that more people would open their minds to immersing themselves in foreign cultures, right? That's kind of, because we all know the value of that.
Yeah.
So we all would hope, come on, people, open up a little bit.
Right.
That's not the only thing to consider here. There is a product that has been created and a lot of money has been invested into.
There's a lot at stake.
And which there is a lot at stake for the people trying to sell that product.
Yes.
And
whether they make another product depends on whether this one sells.
Yes. What they are more concerned about is how can we get the most amount of people to consume this.
Right. Yeah.
And if their research tells them, dub it or change this or this or this specific thing to make it feel more natural to them.
When market being younger.
Whether people. Or not this, I'm not making an ought to be or should be sentiment here. I'm saying if it's true that the company investing all the money into this and putting all the risk, if their research tells them they should change it to sell more, they're going to do it.
It's just going to happen. Yeah. You're fighting against the Mississippi River.
So what should be happening is, can we prove to them that there is a market large enough who want the culturally immersive experience to where they will consider at least an option for that in the game? Right?
I would love it if every game included that option, in which case, sign me up. What do we got to do?
That should
actually, Zakogdo has pretty good
when I talked about diagnosing problems and addressing them appropriately earlier, this is what I was talking about. Going and screaming death threats at translators is not going to solve this problem. Yeah. What's going to solve it
Which, to be clear, Zakogdo didn't do
I'm not
himself.
saying he did it.
Yeah.
I'm not even saying he told anyone to do it.
But it's happening.
It's happening, and it's not the right way to address this problem. What you have to do is come together, ye who believe so strongly in this, and show them how large the market is to put an option in the menu that says, give me the faithful translation instead.
Would one way to do that be making a thread on X and getting millions of views?
Now there's an argument to be made that complaining does work. So I'm not saying complaining is a fruitless exercise. Yeah. What I am saying is
don't piss them off when you do it.
Scream at the person who can't do anything about it.
Right.
Voice your complaints. Do them in an effective way at the people who go, there's dollar signs in the change they're telling me to make.
Throw money at them and they will listen to you.
Then they'll listen.
Right. They might even upcharge you. They might be like, oh, and for $80 you get the better translation.
Right.
If you pay it, you know.
Now, I'm making a very general sort of like analysis here of like, here's like the right way to do it. There's obviously details that have to be filled in that. There's a coalition of people coming together and making a plan.
Yeah.
But that's who you should be targeting, and you should be making a plan that is effective towards that route.
Right.
That is my opinion as to how you're going to get this done, if this is important to you. So stop yelling at the wrong people. Stop harassing the wrong people. Stop screaming into the void. Stop calling me a colonizer as if that's going to do anything. This is a very stupid way to go about solving the problem. And it solves nothing. Yeah. It escalates and creates a level of toxicity for your movement to where people will more than likely dismiss you than listen to you. So anyway, I'm not sure if we fully touched on everything there, but
the medieval, this was your
okay. But largely, I again agree with, or at least respect his reasons for not wanting them to change or fancify the dialogue or make it period appropriate.
I like his reasons as well.
Yeah.
And when I am a student of a language, I want as direct a translation as possible. When I'm studying Japanese, and now that I speak Japanese, I really like to use media to help me continue to learn the language. I want it to be as faithful as possible because I don't want to learn the wrong stuff.
Yeah.
So I want it to be as close as possible. So I become more of a purist in that regard. Right. That being said, there's arguments for that I'm not a huge part of the market. You know, people learning Japanese is a small percentage of the people playing Japanese games.
He goes on to say, I strongly believe that any translation should require the reader of a foreign culture to meet the source culture halfway.
Yes. Very good. I like it. I love the sentiment. Yes.
What is halfway is
One
debatable.
Man's halfway. And even if you find perfect half, guess what? One person's going to say that's half empty, and the other person's going to say it's half full. You found half, and people are still going to be pessimistic.
What is halfway is debatable, but the sentiment I love.
I like the sentiment. This is the third, so we've gone through.
Basically, the way I would reword that, if I can be so bold, Zakogdo, would be to say the audience engaging with the foreign work ought to be willing to do some work.
Yes.
In engaging with this media to understand the source culture.
And clearly there are a lot of people who are willing to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that part I agree with because I would like to do that myself. But is there money to be made in the approach? You guys need to figure that out and then present that evidence to the Nintendos and Capcoms of the world. While this is my own belief, and I know many will disagree with it, I don't believe there should be any difference in that attitude regardless of whether the work is set in a Japanese high school or a Western historical setting. Even something as distinctively Western-inspired as The House in Fata Morgana, a visual novel set across various time periods in Europe and the USA, including a scene where a 16th century French girl puffs up her cheeks in order to show that she's playfully pouting, a mannerism known as, what does that Japanese say?
Oh, geez. One second, I can find it here. Fukurera.
That is distinctly more modern Japanese than the culture it's supposedly portraying. I find this sort of dissonance fascinating, that these little glimpses behind the curtain of the setting of the source culture's differing mannerisms and values still find their way into a work intentionally designed to depict a foreign culture instead. And I think that erasing this sort of thing to take the work and adapt it to match Western impressions, our ideas of how characters should act and how things should be, is a senseless act of homogenization that would erase any reason we would even have in seeking out a foreign media in the first place. That is a perfectly articulated, very sensible reason.
Yes, very good.
I don't totally agree with it in the sense that, again, when I'm engaging with a work, and those two priorities I brought up earlier, I want to be immersed in it, and I want to read beautiful language, and I want it to,
that's right,
like those are things are important to me.
Yeah, me too.
But there could be some cases in which I would agree that this is the approach I would rather see.
Totally, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But his reasons are valid.
Oh, totally.
100% valid.
And it's commendable. It's good. It's a virtue, right? He's
totally a
seeking
virtue.
Understanding amongst other cultures. To a lot of the people who maybe feel like he was going to be really closed. And his whole purpose of this, the reason he cares about Japan at all, is because he is open and likes other cultures and wants, he's seeking to invite other cultures to influence him and his, life. Yeah. Like that's maybe not the exact person that a lot of people thought he was going to be.
No.
So this being said, that does not create the equivalent experience, but it does create a new experience for the foreign, or for the, for us, I guess, for the English-speaking peoples, where we would have a glimpse into a new culture, and that's valuable. The Japanese people didn't quite get that.
Yeah.
Right, but we could have it, and that's valuable. It might be even better to learn about 16th century France through the lens of Japan in English, right? So that you're like multiple layers removed, and you're learning about not only France but also Japan through, I think it's fun. I think it's good.
I'm going to wrap up this question I asked him with this part, and there's actually something you said there that I think relates to this too.
Okay.
To bring this back to Unicorn Overlord, he says, specifically, I think that the idea of such a work being translated as is, rather than as it could have been written by us in the first place, would in it itself have value in being a foreign work that has a distinct flavor. However, I admittedly hadn't even considered that reworking it to resemble classic theatrical English could have been something that was specifically requested by the developers.
Yeah.
Before Matsuno raised that possibility.
Yeah.
That was definitely a matter of short-sightedness on my part. As far as I'm aware, no one from Vanillaware has ever commented on this matter.
And the translators likely won't.
Probably not.
Yeah.
Has ever commented on the matter, so I don't know where they should stand on it. I did try asking the localization producer at one point if he'd care to shed any light on why they'd made certain changes, but he responded by locking replies on the post, so that didn't go anywhere. Okay, two things to say here. First of all, this is another example of where I might try to gently point out to you on that side of the aisle of this discussion. This might be a consequence of how you are approaching talking about this. When you reach out to somebody and ask them for something, they lock replies.
Yeah. Sometimes
when I reach out to talk to people, they talk to me.
I wonder why that is. I don't know.
So what I'm saying is that there's a difference of approach and tone in how you go about voicing your grievances and your criticisms of things. And one will lead to people being closed to you and dismissing you, and one will hopefully open doors and allow for people to have discussions and go back and forth. So
very good.
We weren't perfect in our initial critique of Zakogdo.
No.
But I feel like, in general, the way that we voice our grievances does not lock the opportunity from us having the ability to talk to him later.
Right.
Right?
I hope so.
And so I give that as, again, just general advice for people who feel so passionate about this. If you want to be effective in your movement, you want something to happen, the way that you talk about it is important in that. Now, going on to, he's giving to us. What's the word I'm looking for? Conceding the point.
Right.
I had not considered that the developers might have actually asked for this.
Right.
Because Matsuno did that with Vagrant Story. Right. So short-sightedness. Thank you for being willing to concede that point. Now, here's another thing to consider. If this had been brought up in the Fata Morgana or whatever the freaking novel was he talked about.
Yeah.
If this had been brought up to the Japanese writers, hey, if you make her do this mannerism that's
With
very
the puffy
Japanese
cheeks.
and not very like period appropriate,
Right.
would they have said, oh yeah, maybe we'll change that? This is something that was brought up to us yesterday when we were planning this, that I thought, oh, that's a good question. Had, somebody from the West been like, hey, that mannerism is very like Japanese and not very French.
Right.
But not said you should change it, but just asked, do you intend for it to come across that way? Would they have said, yeah, I still want to keep this Japanese mannerism in there? Or would they have said, intent? Our intent is to be actually as faithful as possible to the period and the culture we're doing. Maybe we should adjust that. And this really comes back to what I think is ultimately the super easy answer to a lot of this problem. The Japanese writers and the English or whatever country localization team should all come together at the beginning of the process. So the story's written, they're developing the game, they're coming together, and they're asking these types of questions. Is this what you intend? Is this what you intend with this? Is this what you intend with this? Yes, we do, or, oh, actually, that's a good point. I think you should change that. But it should be the call of the writer to say that should be changed or not. And I have a great sympathy for the idea of a work that maybe I had written being co-opted by some translator somewhere and changed without my knowledge, right? So I've been writing this fantasy novel forever, and let's pretend for a minute that it was popular enough that they were going to try to translate this into Spanish and a bunch of other languages, and I'm meeting with a translator, and they're doing the work. I would hope they would ask me before making a change, no matter what the change was.
Right.
And a lot of times I would probably agree with them, right? They would probably explain to me, hey, in the culture, this, and this, it might come across the wrong way. Maybe we should change this way. And I would probably say, yeah, sure. Most of the time.
right? 95%.
But there might be just that one instance. And Alex brought this up with Nojima, right?
Yeah.
Where Alex changed a line for Titus because he wanted to give him his father's line rather than repeating Aaron's line, right? And he said, well, I understand what you're saying, but I actually wanted Titus to be getting closer to Aaron here, not to his father, right?
Right.
Like, you should ask those questions before you make the changes.
Right.
And Alex admitted that was a mistake. So the best way to avoid this is just have them talking to each other. The whole way through. And I know that that's not necessarily feasible, and it definitely wasn't the case back in the 90s when we were growing up, where they had no contact almost at all.
They didn't care.
So, and as that's David is saying here, this is exactly what we're supposed to do.
Yeah.
As a Spanish translator, he's supposed to go to the Japanese writer and say, hey, I have a question here. I'm thinking about making a little bit of a change here, and this is the reason why. Are you okay with that or not? Or what did you mean by this? Maybe I'm misunderstanding you.
Right.
That's, in an ideal world, how it should be. Now, as the gaming industry has evolved, especially in the early days, that was not going to happen. Right? They had no contact. They were already working on their next game.
Yeah.
They didn't have any time for this, and Alex brought up a lot of that last time. But we should raise the standard now.
Sure.
This is one of the largest industries on the planet.
Yeah.
It has so much money, like... This should be something that is set as a standard for localization. Get these people talking to each other through the whole process. Make sure that the Japanese writers know exactly what changes are being made and why, and that they agree to them. Or at least that...
someone agrees.
At least that it's all been considered.
Yeah.
Right? And it's not just being done on the fly and, oh, we just won't bring this up. That should never happen. I agree with you guys that should never happen. So, David also says, if you could say this part out loud, it'd be great. The standard procedure is to do it through a shared spreadsheet.
Yeah,
it's called a query sheet.
A query sheet. Yeah.
So apparently there are, that this already does happen, right? So, but all we're saying is that we would hope that this standard is applied everywhere, or that it's applied more in the future than maybe it is currently or has been in the past. So we're on board with all that.
I have a whole story that I'm not going to share about the translation of Lord of the Rings into Swedish, but one day I will share it because
maybe next time.
It's an interesting kind of thing where this exact thing happened.
All right, let's go into question 4.
Okay, question 4. What would constitute a successful translation/localization in your mind? What does a good translation job look like to you? Any examples that I could share that would illustrate what a good translation looks like? And this was Mike asking Zakogdo. So here's Zakogdo's response. Personally, I am a purist. This is the fourth
We probably
method
don't
of
need
translation
to read the rest of that first paragraph. We can probably just leave it at he's a purist, and people know what he means.
And I'm a purist too.
But
because when I learn languages, I want to it be as pure as possible. I like the translator's notes. I like the asterisks. I like all that stuff.
His example he's about to give with Star Ocean 2 is
this is wonderful.
So great.
I love it.
I love this. So let's just go to that point.
All right. Zakogdo. Let me use Star Ocean 2 as an example. It's been one of my favorite games ever since it first came out. Mine too. Well, not since I first played it. Star Ocean 2, I love that game. There are 3 versions of that game now. The original PSX release, the PSP remake called Second Evolution, or SE, and the more recent remake on current consoles and PC called 2R. The original PSX release had a more direct, stilted translation that was typical of its time. SE was completely retranslated with a heavier localization, while 2R reused SE's script outside of some new additions. Star Ocean 2 has a character named Ashton. He's a swordsman who gets possessed by a pair of twin dragons who then stick out of his shoulders. In the PSX version, they're called Gyoro and Ururun in English, the same as they are in Japanese. They're so cool, man. I love those guys. A swordsman in black who fights with twin daggers and has dragons on his back that breathe fire at his enemies. How could that not be cool? So naturally, I bought the PSP version immediately. I think I even bought a PSP to be able to play it. So he was in the hole over $100 for this. Then I got to the scene where Rena names the dragons and she calls them Creepy and Weepy. That's terrible, right? That's so lame, it's stupid. Whoever came up with it is stupid. This whole localization is stupid. I hated that release for ages. I disavowed it. I thought the PSP script was so bad because it ruined these characters I thought were cool from the PSX version. Of course, back then, I didn't know even a word of Japanese, never mind that the PSP version was dub only anyways. It was a smaller screen, I guess. That would have been harder. Now let me explain what's actually going on. He gives some screenshots that we'll put on the screen. Ururun is named after Ururu, which refers to teary eyes, and Gyoro is named after Gyorome, referring to eyes being wide open and bulging, which can indeed be quite scary. Rena is giving them really simple names based on their characteristics, and Claude immediately responds by saying that her naming sense is simple, though the nuance of Angi here is more that it's both simplistic and careless. So the PSX version just let their names stay in Japanese. And the idea that they were these stupid, cringe-worthy names that Claude is shocked by in the original Japanese just isn't there. In the PSP localization, they reworked the conversation to explain the names. They made it more faithful, and that's my interjection. They rendered the names in English as descriptions of the characteristics as they are in Japanese. And Claude calls it dumb because, it's pretty dumb. It's not literal, but it faithfully conveys in English just how lame these names are and why Claude reacts to them the way that he does, which doesn't even have an explanation in the PSX translation. It's a change I absolutely hated before I understood it. But that's the kind of thing where I think a change was made in good faith to provide an equivalent experience, and I think it was necessary, because the PSX translation completely failed to convey the meaning in the absence of the TL notes. I think, the translator notes, I think.
Yeah, translator.
I think the Star Ocean 2 SE localization is pretty good about that in general. There are still some issues with it. Some lines were toned down. Some alcoholic healing items were renamed into juices and such, probably because some party members are underage, and I'm not a fan of how Leon, referring to Claude as Oni-chan, got adapted into dude. But, okay, Oni-chan, that's a whole different argument.
Now, this is something that is not a new problem, too, though. I mean, they have been changing religious symbols.
Oh, for a long time.
All the way back on the NES.
Ocarina of Time. Oh, NES. Yeah,
like,
that's right.
like they took the cross off of Final Fantasy games.
Oh, really?
Right, and replaced it with a different symbol.
Yeah, okay.
They changed
Gotcha.
the holy spell to white.
Yeah, that's right.
In Final Fantasy IV.
Yeah, they took out all that stuff.
Right, so this kind of censorship, this is not like a new thing. This has been and this leads again into our whole point in this long, ongoing discussion that this is more a corporate decision than it is some rogue translator. Even all the way back to the NES, Nintendo of America had policies about Judeo-Christian symbolism in games.
Yeah.
We're not having it.
Yeah.
It was their policy. That's a corporate decision.
Which is what made Xenogears stand out like crazy when it came out, because we didn't have games like that, man.
Yeah.
And they just dove in head first.
And they often would change taverns where they had alcohol served into juices or milk or whatever. Yeah. So this has been happening since the freaking dawn of video games.
Yeah.
And I just want to reiterate, this is way more often a corporate decision than it is a rogue translator's decision.
Yes, that's true.
And I wanted to also add, in case we don't get to it at some point in the document, we might have missed it already, and I think I alluded to this earlier, that Zakogdo was approached by a translator who told him, I wanted to be faithful to this in this translation. I was overruled by my bosses. And this is exactly what we said, going all the way back to our Unicorn Overlord video. Have you, I think the question I posed then was, have you ever worked at a company before? There's 5 levels of approvals above this guy doing this work.
Right.
And it has to be passed all the way up through them and approved. And there's probably somebody up there making the decision to make a change much more often than it is some rogue translator. Now, the caveat to this is obviously, a small translation team that's like more of a freelance company that's translating some obscure anime or some like smaller property anime or something.
Yeah.
Where, sure, that's like a small, tight-knit group of just a few translators, and maybe they're going rogue. That happens. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm saying in the examples that we primarily focus on, which is game translation from big companies like Nintendo and Capcom and Konami and Sony and things like this, these are much more often corporate decisions. And so sitting there screaming and calling for violence against translators is fruitless. Totally pointless and the wrong diagnosis of the problem.
Right.
And he has himself talked to a person who confirmed that very notion.
Right.
So please stop doing that.
To
please.
All the people out there.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't find it. It may have gotten lost somewhere in one of the other ones. But that's the end of that one. So we're on to the 6th question, which is fascinating. He gives a lot of examples here.
This is where we're going to end. This is the last one we're going to do today. So my question to him was, what do you think is the solution to the current problems in game translation? What needs to happen? Oh, this is exactly where he leads. So this is going to lead into it.
This is good.
What needs to happen to fix all of this? What does the solution look like to you? He says, if you asked me this a year ago, I wouldn't have had an answer for you. At that time, I saw the situation as being pretty hopeless, and all I could do was complain for the sake of complaining because I didn't see a way of that anything could change. But this last year, something happened that shifted my perspective. I was contacted by a translator working in the industry. Now, I'm not going to say who they are or what they worked on, but they told me that they worked on a game where a line was deliberately rewritten to tone it down in English, and they strongly objected to that change. But in the end, management decided to go with the change anyway because it was the quote-unquote safe thing to do. So that line got censored, and people noticed it, and they complained and sent negative feedback about it. And the translator was able to point to the negative feedback and make a case to management that it wasn't what people wanted. And management accepted that, and they were able to push for keeping the translations more faithful going forward. So that was a direct example of complaints about a rewrite leading to action, taken to course correct and improve the translation accuracy, and hearing that gave me hope.
Very good.
There it is, people.
Keep complaining.
You can complain, but complain to the right people.
In the right way.
And in the right and most effective way.
Right.
If you had gone and sent death threats to this translator, how unbelievably misguided would that have been? The guy who was going to bat for you internally in that company.
Right.
And just like we said,
he's bad,
all the way back in Unicorn Overlord, he's got 5 layers of approvals over him.
It's not his fault.
Just like we said, have you worked at a company before?
Right,
if you had, you would have known that this is the process, man, in a corporation.
Yeah.
Don't yell at the wrong people. Be effective with your advocacy for change, right? Because you can cause a lot of harm to the wrong people, the people who are on your side, the people who feel just as passionately, who got into this, who love to do translation work and work on games because they love it just like you do, and they want to preserve it just like you do. Mm-hmm. Imagine if you had sent a death threat to that guy. Come on, man. Diagnose the problem correctly. So I'm glad that he brought that up, because that essentially confirms exactly the thing we were bringing up in our Unicorn Overlord video. I want you to kind of go over this part.
Okay, sounds good. He says there have actually been a lot of examples of this recently. Ghostwire Tokyo had the infamous all property is theft, infamous in his circles. I would assume I didn't hear about this. But the all property is theft rewrite, which got revised in an update. Another saving grace to a lot of this is the fact that you can patch and update things. Like just, I know I'm saying this as though it's a new thing. They've been doing it for 15, 20 years now. But it's nice that they don't have to, that the game that you get isn't just like, that's it, right? They can, it's got negative downsides to it as well, but they can update the translation to the physical game that you already bought, like, you know, in the past. And they can fix things ex post facto, I suppose.
Yeah.
So, the Western translation, all property is theft, kid. The Chinese translation, the world belongs to the people.
Yeah.
Japanese original, who knows really, which is sa do daro na. Yeah, sa do daro na means who knows really. And then they patched it in the West. I don't know what happened in China, but in the West they patched it to say, dunno. Well, who's to say? Which is much better for sa do daro na. So very nice. Then Samurai Maiden's English localization scrubbed all mention of the protagonist being at a high school, even going so far as to change a discussion about it to talk about Gen Z instead, which was rectified after many complaints about it. And the examples are too small for me to read, and I wouldn't even know what to read. But anyways, there's a lot of good stuff there. Blue Archive is a Korean game that's outside of your field, but it's not outside of mine. But people have spotted several rewrites that complained about them, and they have been revised. That's been happening with Grand Blue Fantasy as well. There's a whole exchange there that I thought was kind of funny. So FF7 Remake had to patch one, which is the old version said, I miss it. The
Steel Sky.
The Steel Sky. Yeah. And then the new version says the sky, I don't like it. And that's it. Saraidana. A lot of these are introspective, just dana, like things that that Japanese people are basically saying to themselves, basically. Yeah. It's just like, anyways, it's kind of funny. And that's what they keep changing. Even a company as big as Square Enix is doing that when they had to re-record the English line to do it. And perhaps the biggest example is Azure Striker Gunvolt, which was completely retranslated for its PC release following complaints about the original localization, while the original was kept in as an option if people wanted it. This is something we haven't brought up yet. Mm-hmm. The idea that you could put two translations in, you can package a game up with two translations.
I see no downside to this at all.
I don't either. In fact, many of the great works of art, be it poetry or, old classic novels or things from around the world, have been translated many times. You think there's only one translation of Dante's Inferno? You're crazy. You think there's only one translation of Beowulf and then that's it? There's like 100. You think there's only one translation of the Odyssey? Yeah. There are so many translations of these things. You can go for the more literal. You can opt for the more poetic. You can pick a translation that works for you, that you like the most, and then that will be the one you buy, and this is the one that you like, and read to your kids and whatever. Yeah. But video games don't have that option, and it's so unfortunate. But part of it's because, well, most old books written in ancient Italy also aren't translated into English. It's just that one book, Dante's Inferno. All the other ones didn't get it. Like, you got one book from like 13th century Italy, and all the other 13th century Italian books are like lost to time. Okay, that's not true. There's still a bunch of them out there, but you get my point. Maybe one or two video games from our time period will make it 500 years in the future, and all the others won't. And nobody's going to translate, a game that people don't play that much, 50 times so that everyone can pick which one they like the most. So you're really just stuck with the one, right? But the fact that some games have opted to give you both, to give you an original and a retranslation as well, that's awesome. I think that's great. And honestly, we haven't talked much about AI in this whole scenario, but AI can help with that. I'm not saying translators are easily replaceable by AI.
No.
But certain types of translation, especially more literal ones,
could be handled.
Are easily handled, or more easily handled by AI. Whereas the better localizations, the better, in my opinion, better translations that will be more localized and more influenced by the culture that's importing the game as opposed to the exporting culture, it would be harder for AI to do that. I think
100%.
Yeah, but 100%. Anyway, so maybe this will start to happen more. So that's a great example as well. And then I believe that's all the examples here. He says, incidentally, the original localization was done by the same company that handled Unicorn Overlord. And so maybe just another reason why he was already upset at that company.
Sure.
And then, they did it again. Darn it, that company. And then, complain to your internet friends about it on a public forum. And then, whoops. Maybe
everybody
I was a little
too
careless. Yeah, which of course we've already mentioned we can relate. Yeah. But yeah, this wasn't the first time that the studio that translated Unicorn Overlord had misstepped for him. And that's some context that maybe also would help us to understand him a little bit better.
Where the frustration was coming from. Yeah.
So he's saying companies have been taking notice of complaints about these issues for a long time, or recently they're starting to take notice of complaints about these issues. People have been talking about it more, and it's getting back to the original developers more, and we're seeing change, and that gives me hope. I think the Japanese developers are starting to see the problem in the industry, and there are bad apples in there that aren't working in good faith. Yeah, but we're saying they're more top, and he might be implying that they're more lower level.
Okay, so that is happening. I don't want to dismiss that.
Yeah, it is
There
happening.
are bad apples out there.
There are some.
But also that's probably more common that
the widespread
it's a
issue
corporate
he cares
mindset
about
than it is a rogue translator.
Yeah, that's what I would suggest, that is the thing that he should actually care about more than the bad apples. And then he says, and that there are users who would perform more literal translations. He's saying Japanese companies are wising up to this. Good. And they're keeping a closer eye on things and asking for corrections when problems are found. And my hope is that in continuing to point this stuff out, making it known that people aren't as happy with the quality of localizations that we're getting, that there's a real demand for less liberal and more literal. I thought that was good, because at first I thought he was making a political statement by saying liberal.
Not a political statement.
12 days, people. Okay, 12 days from this recording. Okay. But he means liberal in terms of just taking liberties.
Yes.
Right? And then he says more, because I wanted to say this because it's like a slogan: less liberal, more literal. Like, because you just take the B and put in the T, right?
Yeah.
And that's what he likes. I do think there is a large enough market of the literal translation types, so where it should be considered as an option to maybe ship with 2 translations. I think that's the best. And here's the good thing about that solution, because some people would say, that doubles localization costs. I don't think so, because these are the people who are going to play with Japanese voices anyways. You don't need to re-record the voice lines in English. Yeah. You just need the subtitle. Just the text needs to be redone in a more literal translation for which AI can really help. And you do not need to re-record the English, because these guys are playing the game in Japanese voice. I know these people. I'm one of them. We play the game in Japanese voices with English subtitles. That's how it goes. Yeah. Right? Okay. And then at the very end, this is kind of his last note here, it's also worth mentioning games like Yakuza, now Like a Dragon, have provided separate subtitle and English dub scripts to better cater to both audience. I think that's great.
That's great.
It's an expensive option that requires more work, but if companies decide that that's the best way to capture both markets, it's a great compromise.
I want to quickly point to what Zydart over here in our Patreon chat is bringing up, because I was a part of this movement.
Very nice.
Operation Rainfall didn't succeed by sending death threats to Nintendo.
Operation Rainfall wasn't built in a day.
So for those who don't, for those who don't know what Operation Rainfall is, there was
an old reference.
A time in
2009?
ancient times.
When was this?
Back in ancient times.
15 years ago, dude.
When I was in my 20s.
Yeah.
Where Xenoblade Chronicles was not going to be translated and released into English markets.
We were going to miss it.
They were going to leave it as a Japanese-only release, and I was pissed about that. Also, it wasn't just Xenoblade Chronicles. It was also Hironobu Sakaguchi's game, The Last Story.
Yeah, Last Story. That was
also,
and there was another one too, a third one.
The third one was Pandora's Tower.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
These 3 games looked awesome to me. I wanted them so bad. And there were clearly a lot of people upset that they just kept refusing to translate these games. So what happened? A bunch of passionate people got together. They organized and they gave us
strategically
a strategy.
Yeah, it's very good.
They told us, call them every day, send them physical letters and email them every single day and bother them every single day. And I did it. I was one of them. I don't know how many people were as diligent as me, but I did that. I called Nintendo of America every day and said, hey, are you guys going to bring Xenoblade Chronicles to the West?
I'm really
what
interested.
about The Last Story?
Yeah.
Pandora's Tower would be very cool. I'd pay for that if you guys brought it. Okay, thanks, bye. I got to the point where I was on a first-name basis with some of the people at the call center. Like, I talked to them so often that they knew I was calling again, and they were like, okay, we get it, like, yes. But that's what it took, right?
Right.
It took showing them there was a market for these products that they were dismissing. They didn't think there was. We proved that there was.
Not just that. Nature Kicks puts in our Discord, commented, and look at Xenoblade now.
Right.
If you didn't do that.
If I wasn't on the phone every day with freaking Nintendo of America's call center.
The game's huge now.
We would not have Xenoblade Chronicles 3 here.
Yeah. Well, or maybe at all.
Maybe at all. Maybe at all because a large part of the sales and success came from the Western market. Right. And so what I'm saying is, guys, if you want to be successful in your movement, that's the kind of organization and strategy you need. That's what I'm telling you should do instead of calling me a colonizer in my videos.
I love it. Oh
okay? Gosh. Can we agree to that at least? Calling me a colonizer changes nothing. It's going to make me laugh at you, and then you still don't get the faithful translation you want. But if you're on the phone with Bandai Namco and Nintendo saying, hey, I'd like you to provide these localization or translation options in the future, and you badger them about it constantly, and they get enough people doing that, they go,
That's their language. You got to speak their language.
Exactly. So that's what I'm saying.
Some people's language, well, actually, I won't say that. Okay. I also wanted to bring this up, too, because we didn't read his introduction here.
Oh, sure.
He sent us a brief intro saying, hi, I'm Zakogdo. Hi. But also, the second paragraph, which is great, he says, just to clarify before we start, when talking about I talk about localizers throughout, and I'm referring not just to translators, but also to the editors and management people making decisions throughout the localization process of a piece of media. I'm aware there are translators out there just trying to keep their heads down and do good work, and that ends up the work ends up being subject to the whims of overzealous editors and managerial decisions. So I just wanted to get out there.
He knows that.
He's aware, and yeah, a lot of this comes, a lot of the ire ought to be directed elsewhere or not directed at all, because these are people just looking out for number one. And if you help them in that endeavor, they will be more than happy to provide you with whatever you want.
Help you, help me.
Help me, help you, help me. That's so good. It's beautiful.
That's a good way to leave it off.
It's
I hope
great
that
way to
this
leave it
has
off.
been an exercise of engaging in new faith, that people have learned some things that they reconsider. I certainly have.
I have too. He was great. His document was great. He's very respectful.
I agree.
I actually really appreciate his willingness
to engage with us.
Yeah,
after we criticized him in a video,
Right.
Like after we had a whole video talking about have you ever worked at a company before? And like,
he did,
dude,
which
what
he
the heck? This is not inaccurate. Like, come on,
Right.
Like we had a little bit of that kind of tone in some of our criticisms. He called it lambasting. I don't know if I would call it that, but he felt that way, and that's what's important.
He did, and sometimes the lambasting is less our tone and more it was the 20th time that I leveled the same critique at him, and after a while, it becomes lambasting by volume, not so much by like tone.
So apologize for that. I have learned in the future that if I see something like this online, the first course I'm going to take is to talk to this person rather than just comment on their thing.
I think it's a great idea.
That's something I'm going to be better at.
Well,
I will. In the future.
I will learn that too for you as well.
And I encourage other people to do it. It's a good exercise. It helps clear misconceptions. It helps dispel bad assumptions, and it helps you understand people better and poke holes in your own places where you don't have it right, and grow as a person yourself. So anyway, thanks for watching. There will be a follow-up to this. The conversation's not over yet.
There will probably be many.
Alex is coming back.
Yeah.
And if there is anybody else out there who wants to come on the show and talk about this, I would love to do that.
I would love to also. Yeah.
Send me a personal message. Let's talk back and forth. Let's see if there's a way to do it. Let's see if it's appropriate. Let's see if we can, make a good show out of it. Yeah. If there's any Japanese writers, and especially anybody who's maybe bilingual from Japan, so that we don't have to necessarily have an interpreter on for you, which creates a whole nother layer of problems in this discussion. You can speak for yourself as much as possible. We'd love to get the perspective of Japanese writers on this. That's one piece of this that I desperately want to have that I don't necessarily have planned. I don't have a person
we need people
in who could do that. So if you want to do that, please come talk to us.
One of the great things about Alexander O. Smith is that he's a former translator. He's kind of
He's not.
It's not like he's currently
now.
A lot of the people currently in the industry wouldn't really
wouldn't want to comment.
Talk about it.
Yeah, there'd be NDA issues. And just other problems.
I still want to have a job issues.
Yes. So anyway,
hey, we'll be nice.
We'll see you guys again next week. Please look forward to the next episode. Till then, peace out.